We now have at least half an hour for audience participation as promised, that we have an open mic and have your say. There's a few people that I know are going to have something to say, and first one that I'm going to ask to have a word is Mr. Jack Roach, who's the president of the Borrandara Residents Action Group, which is a local group where we're right in his territory now. And Jack, you can either speak from there, or if you want to come up here, that's fine.
No, here's fine. I can see everybody.
Okay.
Thank you, panel. It's great to hear views on this subject because we don't hear enough about it. But my question to the panel, first of all, I run a
if you had continuous photograph of that speaking,
sure.
Oh, I've got it all. Yeah.
We have a lot of members,
But
probably one
what
of the
magic?
biggest groups in Melbourne, but we have great support from our local community. And we've been at the forefront of development issues in our town. Burundara is now known as a major problem for developers. They avoid us like the plague. Our role is to protect what we love about our community. And a number of residents seeking our help on planning issues because of development and trying to cram more into less is growing every day. I'm working something like 7 days a week, not every hour of the day, but I'm constantly on the job talking to people. But those developers are just responding to market forces. The real problem is the rate of population growth. Over the last 15 years, the number of migrants has kept increasing from around 80,000 per annum to currently 245 to 250,000. On top of this, the number of long-staying visa holders has also kept increasing. And there are now well over 1 million of them in Australia. And they stay for a long time. But the politicians supporting a big Australia hardly ever mention that 1 million, which is very misleading in my view. They add to the planning issues, well, they too need somewhere to live, and our infrastructure can't keep up with the needs to cope with their needs, nor our current needs. My question to the panel is, should they be more clearly mentioned in the published immigration figures?
Thanks for the question. Which of the panel would like to take that one? Kelvin, would you like to? Oh, you can also share that one.
Okay. Jack makes an important point. Temporary visa holders have skyrocketed both in terms of the 457 visa program, the 417 working holiday maker program, and overseas students. So yes, there are implications arising from that. In particular, I think there are implications for people who are out of the Australian workforce, particularly young people who want to be in it. And Bob Birrell's done a lot of work in this area to use the expression providing ferocious competition for entry-level jobs. So when we're now in a situation where our youth unemployment is the highest that it has been for some decades, and you have a federal government saying that people must earn or learn, well, that's fine, but you have to be able to have a job in order to be able to earn. It seems to me that these figures need to receive more attention and that essentially those programs need to be capped and wound back to the sorts of levels that prevailed a decade or two ago.
Thank you. William, my name is Margaret. I'm a member of Victoria First. I was fascinated to hear you say that in your talk that the big factor is net overseas immigration, because I haven't really seen that on your political party's website. And given that here in Victoria, with Melbourne such a big part of Victoria, we're heading towards a forthcoming state election, probably in November. I wonder if you could share with us some thoughts about how your party is going to actually confront the election here in Victoria, and how you're going to integrate what you told us today is the big factor, i.e. immigration. How are you going to integrate that into your campaigning on this occasion?
To know that we're a federally registered political party, so we don't actually have campaigning in state elections. We're only registered for the federal election, so it's a different registration process with the Victorian Electoral Commission, so we won't be running in the Victorian election. That's the first thing. So that sort of cuts off the second half of your question, unfortunately. But in terms of the immigration aspect, we've always been very upfront that we're calling for a balance between immigration, permanent immigration and permanent emigration. That's always been one of our two key policies. The other one is that we want to abolish birth payments, things like baby bonuses or payments through the family tax system, or pay parental leave for third and subsequent children. That doesn't please everyone, but it's a balance because you replace mum and dad. That's really all we need to be doing if we want a relatively stable population. So, but we've always been very upfront about the fact that we support what's known as zero net migration or balanced migration, whichever way you want to put it.
I wanted to raise an issue that, to ask a question of Kelvin. Nobody has asked, and it's about the actual survival of Melburnians. Nobody has raised the question of food security with increased population. Population increase predicted 7.7 million by 2015, and the food security is going to be seriously threatened. This has been exacerbated by the extension of the urban growth boundaries in Melbourne into the resumption of arable land, agricultural land. This is under the Brumby and the Bracks, but mostly the Brumby government and now the Napthine government. The practice of land banking in outer suburbs on arable land. There are now 50,000 vacant house lots, vacant on arable land. And the fact that affordable suburbs are being bought up by investors, and if you look at the percentages of units in outer suburban, like Tarneet, there's something like 40% of the units being built are being bought by investors. So the question to Kelvin is, what do you suggest, what kind of action can be taken to safeguard future food security in the coming decades?
Point. It's no accident that the great urban settlements have occurred in places like Melbourne and Sydney rather than, for example, Dimboola. They do get located where the soils are most fertile, but given that, it is then crazy to be paving out over areas which are prime horticultural and food producing areas, and the combination of foreign ownership, climate change, population growth seems to me to be a recipe for tears further on down the road. In terms of what we can do about it, it is one of the reasons, a number of reasons, why we ought to have a hard and fast urban growth boundary, and why it's a matter of regret that Melburnians are constantly stooged about that question. But yes, it comes back to issues to do with population, both in Australia and globally. There is a global population issue which needs to be addressed, and in my view, every country has a responsibility to get its own house in order in that regard. And if we do that, then globally our food security will be in much better shape.
A limit to Melbourne's growth, on the outskirts. Many European cities and highly livable cities in Europe have a population cap too, which goes to sort of the question of temporary visas and things like that. Surely we can really count the number of people that are coming in and out, and keep a tab on that, and set a growth boundary for Melbourne and say this big and no more. And if we're going to have more population, it has to go somewhere else, because the city just can't keep swallowing up valuable agricultural land. And one of the things that William raised, we really should make it an election issue in Victoria, because Victoria's taking most of this population growth at the moment, and the people of Victoria should be able to stand up and say, so far and no further. So really, we need to get a Victorian party going on. You know, like William, or you know, some way that the Sustainable Population Party has to get state branches going too, I think. But it has to become a local issue. It has to be something that we say we're not just going to destroy our agricultural base here.
I have a bit of a... I was rapt that William mentioned this, because it's a thought that I've had for ages, and that is we're sold, well, what I consider a lie, that we need population growth because we are a globalised part of a globalised community. So part of globalisation and economic globalisation is that we import and we export. And the difference between the two is often your standard of living. Often your standard of living. So we've had, since World War II, amazing population growth, obviously unsustainable. And as a result of that structural change, can I just ask for a show of hands in the audience, who in the audience, through their working life, anticipated and actual, has actually exported more goods and services or participated in the exports of more exports of goods and services than they have of importing? Thank you. 2, 3. So I've actually walked into cafes and buildings and I've asked anyone, asked the people in the cafe, how many people do you know who export? And I've seen nobody. So here's a question to the audience. Shouldn't it be a basic question for anyone who wants to come into this country as an immigrant? How will you export from Australia?
For Melbourne's population, but they're also saying that we need 4 times as much per capita in the future. And my question is, do you think we can afford 4 times as much imports each in the future? We've got a wonderful website and a recent report by top academics who are ecological economists talking about the existing values Western Port provides with its ecosystem services and services it provides for recreational values. So please visit it too.
In 2002, when we were formed, we basically accepted the deal that was offered by Melbourne 2030, which was we have extra density, we have 4 million people by 2030, and in return for that we protect our environment, our green ridges, our heritage, and in fact our urban amenity, everything that we love about Melbourne. Thank you. Everything we love about Melbourne was supposed to be protected. Well, of course, we know what happened. Those things haven't been protected, and we got the density. We're way past 4 million now, and so we got one part without the other. So our group has taken a position that until we have a government that can actually protect all of those things that need protecting, we think we should be looking at our population and curbing our population. So we're sort of I was one of the signatories of the population charter that some of us put up before the federal election, and the Green Ridges Coalition is absolutely solid, and most environmentalists are. So it's interesting that the Greens aren't, and I think it would be a really useful dialogue for people here to actually have a meeting with the Greens and just talk to them about why not. I guess I was going to just tell you a few little stories from the trenches, which will make you feel even worse. But I know I think there were about 100 Burundara residents went to the Residential Zone Strategic Advisory Council meetings, and these are like planning panels. They've been meeting around town for a number of councils, not all councils, to decide where the new residential zones go in. And of course, a couple of the new residential zones have got mandatory height limits of 2 and 3 stories, which is vastly threatening to the developers. And so what we had in Kingston, down in Morialla, where we've just had a 10-storey, 9-storey development approved, which is fairly disgraceful on the highway. But what we found is pressure from not just the Housing Industry Association and the Property Council, but from the Metropolitan Planning Authority, which is supposed to be the new authority to plan for Melbourne. And they came down and sort of put their feet on the table and very carefully. They didn't even bother to read what our council planner was saying, and normally I don't support him, but suddenly I was on his side. And they were telling us that we should only have the neighbourhood residential zone, which is the one with the 2-storey height limit, in areas of heritage or neighbourhood character overlay. Now in Kingston we've got no heritage overlay streets, we've got a few buildings, and we've got one neighbourhood character overlay. But in our current planning scheme, we've got 76.4% of our residential area is Res 3, which was roughly approximate to the new neighbourhood residential zone, and we're going to 76.1. And we got huge pressure put on us. You know, the government wasn't going to accept our proposal, so we ended up having to go to Ratsack, as I like to call it. And you know, the minister, you might have noticed, the minister started by saying, this is going to be wonderful, we're going to protect the suburbs, we're going to protect the backyards, and all you have to do is go to your council, we'll support whatever they can justify in strategic terms. Well, he's changed his tune, he's now saying, use the mic. Sorry, he's now saying, the minister was saying, you know, just we'll support whatever your council can justify in strategic terms. He's now saying, I want a direct translation, which means he doesn't want us to have any more neighbourhood residential zone than we had Res 3. And given that some of us were hoping that we'd actually have less people struggling at VCAT, in fact, well, we will have less because they won't be able to afford to go to VCAT because the charges have been vastly increased. So things are pretty crook. Also, I was invited, the interface councils, which are the outer Greenwich councils, had a meeting with their stakeholders, and I got invited to represent the Green Wedges Coalition. And also around the table was Property Council and the UDIA, the Urban Development Institute of Australia. And it was very interesting because they said, you know, the interface council said, well, will you all sit down with us and help us with a submission? I said, yeah, I reckon we would. And the UDIA and the Property Council said, well, not if you're going to talk about green wedges, because we think the urban growth boundary should still be more flexible. They have got a 50-year supply for urban sprawl in what was taken out of the UGB by Minister Madden in 2010 and Minister Guy in 2011, and they still want more. And none of it has been developed yet. And that's, you know, you're looking at a whole lot of stuff on the sprawl on the outs, on the fringe, and a lot of vacant allotments there because it's basically not selling, according to my colleagues in the Municipal Association of Victoria Planning Advisory Group, and yet they are wanting more. And interestingly, they said one of their issues is, you know, where are we going to pay for the infrastructure? They said, we think councils should pay for the infrastructure by selling their assets. They said, believe it or not, they said, do not think, the council should not think that they can use the development industry as a piggy bank. Can you believe it? So this is what it's like. And these people are very confident. I reckon they've got the ear of the minister. I know some of, Clifford and a few people get to see the minister occasionally. We have, thanks to various supports we have as well, and he's very nice when you go and talk to him, but I reckon they go and see him a lot more than we do. So I'd also mention the Plan Melbourne has got, I think, was in the draft, an open space strategy, but one of our members was sitting in one of the precinct planning panel meetings last month for a place called Truganina and Riverdale. You've never heard of it, they won't be built for probably, they won't be heard for, sorry.
Rosemary, we might have to finish this. We're going to run short of time.
I do have a question if you're not interested in hearing about Truganina and Riverdale. I've got a question. We do have a state election coming up. We can make a change. In previous state elections, we've had unpopular planning policy, governments with unpopular planning policies thrown out, namely the Kennett government and the Brumby government. And I think it's really important we focus on this. I think it isn't about waiting till we get our population policies right before you get the planning policies right. They've got to work together. But my question is to William Andrew Clifford. I voted for Clifford in the Senate, and I was a bit concerned about the fact that the micro-parties' preferences, I'm not sure if Stable Population Australia preferences went to Mr Muir and the other micro-parties, but if they did, I'd like to know what you're going to do next time to make sure that doesn't, because we criticise the old parties. We criticise the old parties for being careless about their preferences. I'm just asking what stable population will do to make sure that doesn't happen again, and if it did happen last time.
People that used to vote Liberal, Labor, Greens and what have you, but unfortunately the way the system is, if we then directed all of those votes to say the Liberal or the Greens or Labor, the other 2/3 would be unhappy. So we split ours three-way. However, you know, people then who want to vote Greens after us think 2/3 of their vote's going to go to the Labor and Liberal. So we're between a rock and a hard place on the current system. I'd like to see optional preferential personally, so that people can just go, if they wish, one sustainable population party, and if we get knocked out, they can just do a 2 for their Liberal or their Labor or their Greens as they wish. A relatively simple choice. So that's my preference. We've had to work with a system that I don't like. In terms of the minor parties and micro parties, yes, we felt that because the three major parties weren't tackling this issue, we wanted to form good relationships with a range of the micro parties that were sympathetic to our views, such as the Motorists Party. And I have good relationships with the Motorist Party, and now can walk into their office in Canberra and say, what's the worst thing happening to traffic congestion at the moment in your motor vehicle? And they're sympathetic to our issue. So there's an opportunity that may come out of this, you never know. If I can get in there and talk to them and say, hey Ricky Muir, if you want to look really good in front of the public, you know, why don't you tackle population growth as an issue, and perhaps the Motoring Enthusiast Party will really benefit from that.
To cut to the chase on the coming Victorian electoral issue, a little later on today, Kelvin's going to be mentioning or foreshadowing a motion at the next Victoria First meeting regarding the way Victoria First integrates and spreads the words if it votes to, regarding the reduced immigration write-on, which I'm sorry if some of you at previous meetings have heard about this tactic, but it's very simple, and there are bookmarks on the table up there that explain the concept. Like the no dams issue in Tassie in the early 80s, we are all perfectly legally entitled, no matter who we vote for, which takes care of a lot of politics for a lot of people. You can write 2 words in the clear space at the top of your ballot paper every time you go to vote in a local, state or federal election, because we know immigration and population growth to be the biggest trickle-down issue of all that affects everything. And those 2 words, the more people hear about it, the problem is at the moment, it's very difficult to get the word out about how easily this can be done. But anyway, you'll hear a few words later on from Kelvin about that. And I would just ask everybody to take that bookmark, have a look at the website. It's very easy to tell friends, family, folks, colleagues, and it's got to spread from us, because all you've heard from the panel about the media's hostility. I've spoken to heaps of journalists on this. I've been on this case of population growth and immigration since 1987, every day. And it's no surprise to me what the latest iterations of the population party and so forth are running into. And that is why this idea of a folk movement, regardless of who you place your vote with, you do get to tell them, and it will get around, the same as the no dams thing did. Thank you very much, and over to
On behalf of the Moreland Planning Action Group, a small group of residents in the city of Moreland who took fright at the residential rezoning process that commenced at the end of last year. We didn't like the potential impact upon the suburban landscapes in the city of Moreland, many of which are separate detached houses on separate blocks with nicely developed gardens and very family friendly. I just want to convey an instance to you, however, in relation to that, and it deals with the ways in which rapid population growth bears upon urban planning and undermines the potential for democracy at the local level, at the municipal level. And I'd just like to outline quickly one instance that occurred earlier this year in the city of Moreland. The city of Moreland took the veto, rejected a planning application in a small suburban street in Oak Park in Moreland, Xavier Street. It was for 14 three-storey townhouses in a street with low-density dwellings and gardens. It was on a commercial site. It was an old failed shopping centre site that never really took off. A developer put in an application to build these 14 townhouses, and council rejected that and took it to VCAT. Council did not reject it, however, on planning grounds. There was a driveway on this property that turned out to be a public road, and council thought it had jurisdiction over this road and challenged the VCAT on that basis. It, however, made it clear to VCAT that it had no objections to the development on planning grounds, even though a number of local residents put in objections to VCAT on all the usual grounds, visual bulk, traffic congestion and the rest of it, and it was inconsistent with the local neighbourhood character. Now, the Moreland Council, in its submission to VCAT, went to the trouble of point by point undermining the planning objections of local residents, even though it opposed it on the grounds of this supposed road. And I'd just like to quickly give you a few quotes from the Moreland City Council that it gave to VCAT. And this is a quote. The proposal is an appropriate renewal of land that is currently underutilised, given its commercial zoning and reasonable access to transport and shops. The subject land is located in an established urban area with good access to a range of infrastructure and services. The site is approximately 300 metres walking distance from the Oak Park railway station and shops. The Oak Park Village shopping strip is located just east of the station, providing good access to local shops. Now, what is interesting about that is that the month prior to that, in February this year, the Moreland City Council published a document where it examined many locations within Moreland for their suitability as neighbourhood activity centres. It in fact rejected the Oak Park shops because to the west of the Oak Park shops, the access was very poor, contrary to what it put to VCAT. Access from this site was very poor. Well, my question basically, yes. We're currently in a situation where people are lobbying to have local government given constitutional recognition as a level of government and not just some sort of creation of state governments. And yet here we have a situation, I think, really right across Melbourne, but here's an instance of it, where local government is simply not up to the task of behaving democratically. And I sort of appeal to the panel to make some comment on that. Thank you.
Maybe Sheila?
Tiresome, isn't it, always coming to occasions where all you do is sit there knowing 100 times more than the speakers and all you can do is ask questions. Not that I mean to reprove the person who commented on asking questions. Yeah, I mean, democracy is just not beholden, is it, in this country where all our values are turning to making money? It seems to me that in a profit-driven society, where there is money to be made, it's always going to override every other consideration unless you have social institutions or what I would prefer, a European civil code, which all the countries in Europe adopted, based on the French civil code. And why shouldn't we? I mean, most countries in the world have civil codes or customary law. We're just a bunch of a minority that have common law. But yeah, without those civil institutions that have been overridden by privatisation, again on the profit motive, how can you possibly preserve democracy?
Something on that, Ernest, I believe in local democracy, and I do believe that planning power should be at the local level. That, you know, state could set some objectives, but how they're carried out should be at the local level. But often I've found on council, and I'm sure other people who've been on council, find that they're often not bullied, but very much hammered by the planning department about what the government will accept and what they won't accept, and what VCAT will allow and what they won't allow. It's not right. Councillors should make their own independent decision. And often they'll make decisions that a lot of the community mightn't like. But if they don't, at least you've got the power to throw them out. You can't throw out VCAT members and you can't throw out the heads of planning in departments, but you can vote against councillors and state politicians that don't make the decisions that you think are right. And I do think it is a matter of returning planning power to the local level, and if you don't like it, vote against it.
Chair, I'm not part of your group. I've been around Canberra for about 20 years. I pulled a scheme with net present value in the billions out of 2 Prime Ministers, and I can say this, that it seems to me that democracy is really your ability to appoint your representative. After that, it seems that governance really matters between stakeholders. And the only way that you can make a difference, I think, is to become a stakeholder or a very active lobby. And I think it's about time the public had a lobby, instead of leaving it purely to those who add a few dollars to the product and then go up and lobby successfully. So I'd like to make that one comment. And I've heard some of your concerns about growing Melbourne, but I think Melbourne is on the most ideal greenfield site of any city. And what it is, it's on a site that's greenfield because we have the city of Melbourne and we have the city of Geelong nearby. We don't have to join them, but we can grow Geelong and we can keep Melbourne as it is. We don't have to cut up Melbourne, nor do we have to go out to the arable land towards Gippsland. We have the Bellarine Peninsula, which is substandard land. We have the ability to actually link, we have the ability to have a road and rail system around Melbourne and Geelong, 2 cities by the bay. We have the ability to be able to link the 2 peninsulas of Melbourne, and we can stop this crisscrossing of Melbourne. We can stop the population problem that we may have in Melbourne, and we can have an extremely viable city with the freight coming from Hastings, if Hastings goes ahead, across the bay to the west. We have that ability to do that right now. And if you're against population growth, well, you're against it. But I can tell you something, we have the best position to actually take population growth and to spread it. That's the comment I'd like to make.
Just why we don't have to have population growth. We've already had an awful lot. Why not enjoy the Bellarine Peninsula and Hastings and the Mornington Peninsula and all those other parts of the whole world? For the natural world, there are enough humans, there's enough expansion.
How do we get the left, centre and right who have political vested interests together on this issue? Second question is, Metropolitan Planning Authority, I seen that at a hearing in May early this year concerning Morland where I was there. They had a map showing all different growth areas. One of them was dual, one was a section of road, I don't know, or in orange or red. Has anybody seen that map, and how can people obtain that map? Because I think that's where the real high-rise growth is.
.com.au, we're a lobby group lobbying to raise awareness of the population issue. I also have to say I'm a very proud member of SPA and SPP. The two are complementary. I have a short statement here I wanted to read on behalf of the members of Population Growth Slow Down. We have reached a crossroads and must now make quite possibly the most important decision in our entire history. A decision which will affect untold generations to come. Will this continued rapid population growth make for a better Melbourne, a better Australia, or is this a growth to ruin path destined to end in economic, environmental and social disaster? Are there limits to growth in a finite land? Population growth masquerading as economic growth is a system whose success is measured in ever-growing numbers on corporate balance sheets. It is underpinned by the assumption that this so-called growth can be sustained indefinitely and necessarily leads to an enhanced condition for all. In my view, a very seriously flawed assumption. Yet this religio-economic growth dogma goes largely unchallenged. This growthism ideology is now generating its own momentum, which must be maintained and accelerated for it to continue to deliver the numbers which please its legion of corporate and political beneficiaries. New ideas that threaten growth are waved away by narrow, closed minds, unwilling to consider alternatives or consequences. If growthism be our lot, then Melbourne must grow from 4 to 8 to 16 million, growth ad infinitum. You will never hear a growthist discussing when this scheme will end. Even as it becomes obvious it is destroying society, nature, per capita wealth, quality of life, even democracy itself. This path does not recognise limits. But we do have a choice. We can choose to elevate those very things which growthism destroys to their rightful position as true and worthy alternatives to growth. We can measure our progress using concepts such as operating in balance with our environment, improving health and education delivery to all, quality of life measures such as first home affordability in desirable locations, improved traffic flow, air quality, access to green spaces and wilderness areas. There are many more. But to meet these goals will require recognising the limits to growth, the existence of optimums and the need for balance. I believe it is time to change direction. Change brings both challenges and opportunity. If we believe that we should no longer continue down this growth to ruin path, if we have the courage to face change, if we can accept both the hardships and enormous opportunities arising from this challenge, then Melbourne will once again have a positive future. Thank you for listening.
Together on this issue, Michael, you can have my job. That's fine. And of course, we all need to turn our minds as to how to get political outcomes in relation to this. I think William's suggestion of a national vote has merit, campaigning for that and trying to lift it up the totem pole. But all good ideas are welcome. What we are trying to do is to recruit people and to grow, and things like this meeting are very useful in that regard, and I certainly thank people for coming along and supporting that. In relation to the zoning, Rosemary and others have made comments about the zoning process that the Victorian Government is going through. All I can do in relation to that is to urge local communities and neighbourhoods to stand up for the things that they want. You know, if you want high rise, that's fine, but if you don't want high rise, it's all right to argue against that. And don't worry about being called a NIMBY. You just need to have broad shoulders. And in all seriousness, when we talk about population growth, what we are saying is we not only object to it being in our backyard, we do not support it being in someone else's backyard either, so there is nothing actually NIMBY about it at all. But the essential thing is to stand up for our rights as residents, to a say in how our community and how our neighbourhood looks. That's the thing.
I'm a member of Victoria First and SPA. Members of the AWPC are concerned that over 500 fauna and flora species and ecological communities are listed as threatened under Victorian legislation. Some of Australia's most endangered plants and animals live in Melbourne's doorstep, but urban expansion could lead to more local extinctions. Housing developments at Cranbourne are threatening the southern brown bandicoot. 2 wildlife corridors set out in a 2011 draft version of the bandicoot strategy would have connected the Cranbourne garden bandicoots with other populations around Koorie-Rup, taking up a mere 72 hectares of the 5,260 hectare housing growth area. But this has been dropped. A few houses sacrificed was too much leeway for the survival of the bandicoots. Native grasslands are among the most heavily cleared and endangered ecosystems in Victoria. Any plans for wildlife corridors have been ignored. The rate of coastal urban sprawl over the past 20 years is alarming. The dramatic growth of human populations directly and indirectly leads to many of the pressures that biodiversity faces worldwide. Thank you.
Vivian, for presenting that case, but also sort of Ms Dutton responding to the comment by the lady who was talking about development in Hastings. This whole wildlife corridor business is really, I guess this is what exposes the complete dishonesty of development and planning and government in Victoria, because you can give them superb maps, very carefully worked out wildlife corridors well before any events, and they just ignore them. It is really appalling, and in fact I know Vivian cares about kangaroos enormously and didn't mention them, but it's just terrible to see kangaroos trying to make a living beside highways as they lose their homes, and then listening to the absolute sort of claptrap. I can't think of an adequate description from ridiculous ecologists who've sold their souls and saying that kangaroos are overpopulated. I mean, it's just so ridiculous and so cruel. We've become such a cruel society for money and population growth. We're very depraved in our actions towards our native animals, so we should stand up for them.
My name's John Walker. I'm a member of the Sustainable Population Fund. My question really alludes to William's comment about the dashboard. I heard we had 22 years of economic growth, GDP growth, which I guess you could extrapolate that to mean that I should be 3 times richer than I was 22 years ago.
Talking to the microphone.
Okay. I guess that means I could extrapolate that to be that I should be 3 times more prosperous or wealthier than I was 22 years ago. So what's on your dashboard, William? And is there some well-researched numbers that we can use to sort of evaluate the effect that population growth has on our prosperity?
And aggregate, obviously. The media doesn't usually talk about per capita because it's just basically stagnant since the GFC. I know that Kelvin and others have spoken a lot, so these aren't really necessarily my ideas, but a whole range of things we need to take into account in terms of our well-being, and it is about biodiversity, it is about housing affordability, employment, and these real things that impact on our lives, so whether you've got a job, those sort of things, and I've heard Kelvin talking about those in Parliament as well, so I'm sure that he may wish to add a couple of comments.
Yes, it is a shock when economists and the like talk about GDP. What they're not telling you is GDP per capita. So the idea is if there are more people in your street, you are richer, whereas in fact that is not necessarily the case at all. So you do need, and the other thing about GDP is, if this place caught fire and burnt down, that would add to GDP, but it wouldn't necessarily be a good thing. So you need other indicators of performance, and quite a lot of work is done in this area, but the one that interests me right now, I mentioned the OECD said they've been surveying people, what they say is important to them, and they say health. So I reckon some of us should be elevating health in neon lights and the various things like looking after your environment appropriately that assist our health, and doing things about diabetes and obesity and all the other things in life which are bad for our health, and I think we should be trying to elevate that as a performance indicator.
Jeff Leach, I'm in the city of Melbourne, and that happens to be the fastest growing municipality in the country, is what we're constantly told. And I've been involved in planning activities and issues about heritage and neighbourhood character for probably 20 years now. My question's about politics. Kelvin, we applaud your efforts, but really the Labor Party switched from a big Australia to a small Australia, from Rudd to Gillard, but we haven't really seen true small Australia policy come out of the Labor Party. I get the feeling you're a bit of a lone soul in the Labor Party. I just want to hear, what's like being in the Labor Party, holding the position that you do, But also on the politics, I'd like to have a bit of a recap on the last federal election from the SPP. Whether you thought mission accomplished, objectives achieved, partly achieved, or whether it was a disappointment.
We haven't got time for me to give you a serious and considered response to what it's like running this particular issue. There are plenty of colleagues who would prefer not to debate this particular issue and to debate issues that they're more comfortable with for a range of reasons. I continue to pursue it because I believe it is absolutely critical to the nation's future and to the future of the planet. So I pursue it knowing that there is very considerable public support for it. Anytime people get asked this question, somewhere between 2/3 and 70% say they don't want big Australia, they don't want the present rate of population growth that we are experiencing. So I'm emboldened by that. I hope through the activities of Victoria First to build up a membership and support base that will cause my colleagues and people in other political parties to take notice, because in a democracy that is what it is about. If you are a small group of people, you are unlikely to win the day. If you succeed in becoming a large movement of people, then people will take notice of you. And when Julia Gillard said she wasn't in favour of Big Australia, there was a political backdrop to that where you'd seen people in the Greens and people in the Liberal Party starting to talk about the extent of migration and population growth that Australia was going through. So if we can recreate that kind of political climate, then it does seem to me to be possible that we will get a change of direction, and we certainly need it. Otherwise we will see we've got very serious youth unemployment, long-term unemployment, things like that which are showing up now and deteriorating, and they will continue to deteriorate until we can get this issue up the political totem pole.
SPP's election performance, I've done a couple of post-mortems, and look, I think we did a lot of things right, but we did some key things wrong. You'll have seen some branding and other changes, and some challenges around competing with, if we had been, we missed out on registration for the 2010 election by a week, and that was the Big Australia debate, so we may have missed a really critical time to be running. Similarly, we didn't get right some branding issues, and we had to not compete with 20 parties as in 2010, but 50 parties, and Clive Palmer taking the protest vote, and just the media suppression and other big challenges. So yes, frustrating would be the one word I'd say.
Very much what I came here today to say, but I don't know if there's anyone else here from one of the growth corridors around Melbourne. I've come up from the southeast, from Cardinia Shire, and I moved there in 1998. It was a fairly socially cohesive, small, semi-rural community. Fairly sustainable, you would say. The next 10 years, the government proclaimed that it was to be a growth corridor, and from then till now, I've watched the juggernaut of development come across the landscape. And I can relate to everything I've heard here today from each one of you, so I don't think I need to go back over it, particularly with Vivian, what she said before about the creatures. I see them regularly every day. Every other day, a kangaroo dead on the side of the road, because that's where the urban growth boundary is. And once you go there, well, driving fast motorists, too bad for kangaroos. I've seen the local creeks be spoiled, turned into stormwater drains and polluted. So, you know, I could tell you lots, but I'm not going to worry too much to waste time now. I can also relate to what Julianne said about food security. I've seen the paddocks, green paddocks, the landscape going under concrete and bitumen and roofs. And that's not going to be any good in the future when people are looking to somewhere. I believe the state government's about to extend the urban growth boundary again out where we are. And my main concern today perhaps is something that I'm seeing in Plan Melbourne, which is the fact that the government, state government, put out a big glossy brochure urging people to move out to the regions and the country cities like Ballarat, like Bendigo,
Geelong, whatever, move out there and make your lifestyle there. I'd rather have watched the transition of the growth corridor where I live, or I'm just outside of it. I'm an escapee from the growth corridor. But I've seen that, and I'm concerned when I see this urging people to go out to the regions and the cities. Then you get your councils, they have to plan this, they have to provide infrastructure, your rates go up, and I can see then there's got to be fairly rigid planning. I also relate to Rosemary West because she knows the planning system in and out, and that's our enemy to a large degree because it's in stone, and councils, if they're weak, and we do have a weak council, they won't do anything about it. They just, Matt, you guys say something, they say, yes sir, no sir, what next sir? So I understand all those things, and I can see these country cities that perhaps are managing now. I met a gentleman from Bendigo at one of the Melbourne group talks up at Spring Street, and he said his big concern was the trees were going to come down and what were people going to do for water. So I guess I'd just like to put it to the panel quickly. Nobody seems to have realised, some people I've heard are even thinking, oh, well, that's a good idea. All this excessive population, we can just ask them to go out to the rural areas and to the cities and the regions. Well, I don't think that's a good idea. That's not an answer to the problem. I think that's going to make more problems after what I've seen of the development of a growth corridor. So would anybody on the panel have a comment of whether we should be sending everybody out to the cities, into the rural areas?
Gloria, it's quite obvious that we only have a small green fertile fringe around a huge desert and rangeland, so there isn't enough water, and we're lacking trees, and we've got salinisation and acidification of soils and everything. You only have to look at the 2011 State of the Environment Australia report, their last conclusion on biodiversity and population growth, just about, and resources. We don't have the resources to grow population in our narrow and fragile fringe.
Yes, thanks very much for those comments, and I agree. Look, regionalisation is part of the big plan, but it's really just spreading the problem elsewhere. It's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, and we've got to tackle the real problem, which is the population growth. Just spreading it around, it just means we're just going to destroy the environment somewhere else. And we talk, this whole thing about being NIMBYs applies to population too. People say, oh, why shouldn't we take our share? With population's a worldwide problem. But let's start protesting locally and doing things about it locally and spreading the word throughout other countries too, that this problem, we're letting go for economic reasons or whatever, for powerful vested interests. People have got to stand up and say, we must be counted on this issue. We can't just say, let it happen somewhere else.
Soprano, I was a great activist in the women's movement in the 70s. Now, what I wish to ask the panel is if you are aware of a situation when John Howard was the Prime Minister and Senator Harradine was the Tasmanian Senator. Now, what took place was that John Howard, as Prime Minister, wanted certain legislation passed. Senator Harradine had the capability of approving that and allowing that to go through. But he exacted a price from John Howard, and that price was to stop sending contraception to the women in Africa. And Howard agreed to it. Now, what I would like to know, or what I'd like to say, is that many of these people from Africa are getting onto boats now and drowning, trying to get to Italy. And this is all part of the overall problem. And what I would like to ask, does anybody know that since John Howard ceased being Prime Minister, if the resumption of sending contraception to Africa came about? Because I suspect strongly that it hasn't.
I can answer that. What you say is correct, but the foreign aid arrangements were changed after the change of government. While Stephen Smith was Minister for Foreign Affairs, he he changed those arrangements in terms of Australian aid, and there's a cross-party group of parliamentarians called Parliamentary Group on Population and Development. Doesn't do anywhere near enough on population in relation to Australia, in my view, but is quite good in terms of women's rights in relation to family planning and contraception, and I'm a member of that group, but it played a role in ensuring that that arrangement changed. There is more serious damage done as a result of the Bush administration and the United States, the way it conducts its foreign aid policies, where it puts in place similar barriers to access to family planning for women in developing countries. And you're right to identify that as an issue of concern. It is very important that women in developing countries are empowered directly in relation to family planning and indirectly through education. So I'm sorry to sound a bit Vladimir Putin, but we do need to finish our meeting up. Now, Dennis McCormick flagged in the open mic session that he had a resolution which he has provided to me. His resolution says, we being members of Victoria First request that the Executive Committee of Victoria First bring this motion to the next constituted meeting of members of Victoria First, that Victoria First endorse the Reduce Immigration Right-On campaign as a non-partisan strategy to raise awareness of the need to reduce net overseas migration, encourage voters to use their ballot papers as a legitimate vehicle for popularising the Reduce Immigration message, advocate the benefits of the campaign to other organisations, e.g. SPAR, ACF Greens, etc., that share Victoria First's concern about high immigration rates, force feeding our high population growth rate, and promote the Reduce Immigration Right-On campaign as part of Victoria First communications to its members and to the general public. That is asking something of the Victoria First executive, and I'm proposing to treat that as a foreshadowed motion for Victoria First members rather than something that requires a debate or vote here, but I will ensure that proposed resolution is put to the Executive Committee and then put forward to a subsequent Victoria First meeting, and that people are notified in advance of that occurring so that they can consider it appropriately. Now, there is a motion also that has been handed to me saying that on the basis of the state of the environment reports and in the interest of democracy, the meeting calls on the federal government to hold a national vote on population at or before the next federal election with a proposal to allow Australia to stabilise its population by 2040. A working group will be formed by concerned citizens in order to draft an appropriate question. Now, it hasn't got a mover. We've got someone who's proposing to move in that direction.
Yeah, I'd like to move that motion, thank you.
All right, and you are?
Jonathan Page.
Jonathan Page. All right, and do we have a seconder? I've got Sheila, okay. All right, well, look, in view of the time, unless someone takes great exception to this, I'll propose to put this resolution to the meeting now. Okay. That on the basis of the state of the environment reports and in the interests of democracy, the meeting calls on the federal government to hold a national vote on population at or before the next federal election, with a proposal to allow Australia to stabilise its population by 2040. A working group will be formed by concerned citizens in order to draft an appropriate question. So I'll put that resolution. Those in favour, those against, and I'll declare it carried. This meeting calls on the Victorian Government to convene a scientifically based Victorian conference on what constitutes a long-term environmentally sustainable population for Victoria, with reference to the Victorian State of the Environment reports of 2008 and 2013, indicating environmental damage from current population levels. So now, where did that one come from? Julianne? Yes. Okay. And is there a seconder for it here?
Yes, I'd like to speak to it because 2008 and 2000.
We've got to give you a microphone.
Thank you. The State of the Environment reports of 2008 and 2013 covered this about the damage to the environment of Victoria, and wider than that, we've talked about food security. Vivian Ortega's talked about, and Sheila have talked about the biodiversity and the depletion of resources, water supplies and so on. Absolutely no notice was taken of that, and I might say that we had a parliamentary inquiry into the extension of the urban growth boundary in 2010, and it was knocked back. There was a huge community support for retaining the existing urban growth boundary. So I would like this, we're calling on the Victorian Government to convene a conference on what constitutes a long-term environmental sustainability for the population for Victoria. And if they don't listen, we'll be calling on the shadow cabinet because the election is coming up very shortly.
All right, thanks.
Okay. Well, I'm going to close the meeting now, and thanks for your attendance. If you would like, there are two tables down the back, one for Victoria First and one for Sustainable Population Australia. And we have books for sale on the SPA stall, and on the Victoria First stall there are copies of Kelvin's speeches. And I've just been reminded that this meeting's been filmed, and to look out for it on YouTube. Is that right, Sheila?
Well, don't forget the mainstream press will probably not report this quite major event because we don't usually get there with so many people. It's up to us. The mainstream press is very unlikely to report this event, well certainly not significantly, but we can report it. So when you find out about the YouTube films and so on, please send them round. Talk about them, write to Can Do Better and anywhere else. It's up to us to make the media. We can't rely on the mainstream media.
Thanks everyone for attending.